The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, welcome. My name is Travis McGrath. I'm the lead client service manager here at Exago, and thank you for joining us on today's support lab. As you know, the support labs are a monthly series. Every month we do one end user and one technical webinar where we do a deep dive on a topic. Today we're actually going to do one of my favorite technical topics, which is an extensibility feature called report and folder management. Everyone attending today is on mute, but in the right-hand corner of your screen, you should see a questions panel. And if you could just go ahead and type a yes or a Y or a hello so that I know everyone can hear me, that would be great. Okay, good. I see those coming through. So we're coming through loud and clear and everyone can see my screen. That's good. Some of my colleagues, Alex, Emma, and a few others will be answering questions as we go. Though if there are specific questions that are good for the group, they'll point those out to me and we'll get those answered for everyone as well. So just a quick disclaimer about today's lab. We are going to do a technical deep dive into some code. So this is going to be fairly code heavy. We're going to use some C#. We're going to talk about some SQL and some database tables. And we're going to talk a little bit about XML and JSON. That said, I don't like leaving anyone behind, so I'm going to try to keep it very understandable for folks who aren't familiar with those languages, even as we go through them. So before we begin, I have one other, so I just want to go through an agenda here before we dive into the topic itself. So we're going to start with a small disclaimer beyond the one I just gave. After that, we're going to, of course, talk about what is folder management at a high level, what it consists of, why you might use it. We're going to talk about why you should use it, in fact, not only might you, but it's our recommendation here as a best practice. We're going to look at a sample code, and this is a sample that, as you'll see, is something you can download on our support site. So all the samples we're going to be using today, you can actually implement yourself. And then we're going to, of course, have time at the end for a Q&A. All right, so to get started, I have a small disclaimer here. While we're talking about our folder management feature, which has been in existence since 2011, so it's an old established feature. Later this year, at the end of the summer, in our version 2018.2 release, we do have some enhancements planned. I'm going to talk more to these at the end of the webinar, just as sort of a teaser for you. But I wanted to give you a heads up because there are some great changes coming, and as this is one of my favorite features, I'm just pretty excited about it. The other thing I want to mention here is that despite the fact that there are some changes, if you aren't using folder management today, you should look at it in its current incarnation in 17.3 or whatever version of Exago you're using. I'll talk about what that transition looks like at the end as well, but I think it's a great feature, and if you can use it today, you absolutely should. Okay, so what is folder management? Now that I've mentioned it a bunch of times, it's an extensibility feature, and we've seen extensibility features in other webinars. So for those unfamiliar, these are features that allow you as the host application that's embedding Exago to have control over some of the behavior of Exago as it runs beyond just the initial permissioning given to you by the API. And it's an extensibility feature that specifically controls where report definitions are stored. So what's going to happen is as Exago runs, instead of using the default, which is to store report definitions, folders, themes, and document templates on the file system where Exago is installed, it will call out to a code handler that you can build, specify, and customize to say, here's this report definition, please save it. Or I'm looking for this particular report definition, please retrieve it from wherever you have it and give it to me. So this is a way where you can control where those definitions reside. Now, most of our clients who utilize this feature use it to store folders and reports and themes and document templates into a database. The advantages here You might say, well, why would you do that, right? So architecturally, it lets you store them into a database. This lets you have fine-grained permissions, so you can control who has access to which reports and folders, and you can have everything be done automatically from that database. Because it's in a database, it's easy to back up, and of course, it's centrally located. And then additionally, because it's your custom code and you can do really anything you want with it, it gives you some capabilities here to have additional features as well. So for example, instead of just deleting a file from the file system and it's lost, you can do things like have soft deletes, you can build in revision history, sharing, things like that. Okay, so how does folder management work? So the first recommendation here, you don't have to do this, but we're going to recommend that you take a look at our sample code that's available for download on our support site, even if you don't want to use it as your base. We're going to walk through this code in just a moment. Yep, and so the code I'm going to show, we're actually going to download it from the support site, and anyone with access to download Exago can also have access to this code. That code, of course, is going to utilize a database. So the next step is we're going to set up our database, and I'll show you, I already have the database set up here, but I'll show you what it looks like, the schema, all those sorts of things. Then we're going to review the code sample, and we're going to, of course, have it be built, and there's some step-by-step instructions for how to do that. There is, of course, a little bit of configuration. Exago needs to know what code to use for folder management and that it should use folder management. And really, that's it. So to begin with, we're going to go to our support site and download this package. So on our support site, support.exagolink.com, I've already logged in here with my account. So up in the top right, of course, you'll have to log in. And then we go to the downloads page. And in the downloads page, you can have access, of course, to the installer if you have permission to download Exago. But if we scroll down just a little bit past the installers and the updating guides, we'll see an extensibility example. And in a previous lab, my colleague Nick and I, we've both made reference to this theme maker, but right below that we have the folder management code. And this comes to us as a zip file. Now, to spare you folks from having to see the internet speeds here, I will spare you from having to download it. We already have it, so I'm going to go over to our desktop. And we have this folder management code as a zip file, and I've already extracted it here. So I'm just going to open this up. And inside, we find a folder with a Visual Studio project, a code project, a couple of other files that we'll need, as well as a README. And in that README, we're just going to open this up. And in here, we'll find we have step-by-step instructions for how to set this up. So this is going to talk very similar to what we're going to do in just a moment, where, to reiterate, we're going to set up our database, we're going to configure Exago, and we're, of course, going to build the code. So I just want to pause there. Does anyone have any questions on how you can access this sample or on how folder management works? I should also mention, as we do want to go through a lot of code here, this is, of course, like all our webinars being recorded, so you'll have access to it later as well. Okay, great. So we've downloaded our example, and we've looked at that README file. The other thing we're going to want to look at here is our documentation. So if I'm on our support site, we have our search bar at the top, and you can just search for the word folder management. And in this case, I already have the article open, but it's the top link when we search for folder management. And in here, this is the technical documentation on how folder management works. This is a great resource to have, particularly as you're customizing and tailoring your folder management code. Great, so we've got it downloaded. The next thing we want to do is talk about the database. And so I'm going to switch back to this full screen presentation here. So the database for our sample, and of course you can do this differently if you'd like to, but the database is going to have two tables that we're going to concern ourselves with. The first one is the report table, right? If we're storing reports and folders and things like that, we're going to need a table to store those that information in. So we're going to create a table we call the report table, and in here we're going to store reports, folders, document templates, and themes. Now we've covered document templates in one of the end user labs, so these are going to be more minor parts, but I will talk to them a little later on as well. And then for this example, we're going to have another table we call the access table, or I believe the SQL is actually going to call it the report access table. And in here, we're going to store what permissions each user or group of users has to access various reports. That way, when we're launching Exago and we're building a list of reports for a user, we can join these two tables and get only the reports and folders a particular user should have access to. So to see that in the database itself, we have a couple of things to mention here. So going back to our folder management download, you'll notice in here that we have a SQL file. So let's see here. So in our README, we're going to look for the file Exago database SQL.txt. That's the file we want. So in here we have Exago database SQL.txt. And opening this up, this here is going to create a database, though of course we can add these tables to an existing database if we want. And it has the SQL to build these tables from scratch if you don't already have them. In our case we do, so we're not going to copy paste this, but we could. And each column has a comment explaining why it's there, what it does, etc. We won't read these through one by one, but obviously we're recommending a database architecture here. We wanted to explain what each column is for and why we use it. So this is, of course, our reports table, and then we have our report access table. Now, I want to show you a sample of the database itself. So I'm going to open up a program we use called DB Visualizer and just show you a database over here. And the two tables we care about, the reports table and the report access table, are right here. We'll start by looking at the reports table. So in this case, we're looking at the definitions of all the reports, folders, themes, and document templates. Now, there are a couple of key parts here, right? Each report has a name. It has content. And so this could be for a report, like say a dashboard or an Express view. This could be a XML content or a JSON string for Express views. Document templates, for example, in this case we have a Word document template, RTF document template. This might not be in the content column, it might be binary content. So for document templates, we have another column here. And we have a column indicating which elements are reports or versus folders. Those are this flag here called leaf flag. So if something is a leaf, that means it's a report. If it's a if leaf flag is set to false, that means it's a folder. The type indicates is a value to indicate whether we're talking about a report and folder, which means type 0, a document template, which will have type 1, and a theme, which will have type 2. And these will become important later on. You'll see in the code, we're opting in a filter by this column here. We're adding in the capability to have a soft delete by using this isDeleted column. So if a user deletes a report, that report won't be stricken from our database. We'll simply change this flag over to say that it is deleted. And then in future calls, we'll avoid sending it to Exago. But if the user calls us in a panic and says, hey, I deleted a report last week, I need it back, we can easily change this back. The theme type is just going to tell us which themes are meant for charts, Express views, maps, etc. And then we've got a series of columns that we've added to keep track of who created and last modified a report. And then over on the far right here, critically, we're going to have a report ID. This is going to uniquely identify a report. So those are all the columns in our database table for reports. I just want to pause there. Are there any questions so far? A great question came up, which said, what if we don't have the folder management option on our download site appear under the extensibility? So if you come into Exago to download the capabilities here and you don't have the extensibility, it likely means you also aren't listed as one of the contacts who can download Exago the installer here. So that's something that you would want to reach out to our webmaster or your primary contact with Exago, and we can grant you permission to download the sample here. Okay, great. Jumping back to the database, the other table we talked about is our report access table. So here we're storing all of our reports, and in another table we're going to store who has access to each report. Now this table is a little complex. So in here, of course, we have the report ID. This is going to match up to the reports from the other table. And then we've stored some permissions. So we're using the word party the way you would think of, say, a lawyer using the word party to indicate different types of groups. A party might be everyone for reports that we want all of our users to have access to. It might be a specific group, a company, or an individual user. So the party type is going to tell us what level of grouping we're talking about. And then the ID is going to tell us specifically within that group, which company, which individual user. And then we have some additional columns here. So of course, folder management can control those read-only lock icons. So if you see standard reports that are read-only for some users, this is how we can control that capability. We also can do things like return the reports in a specific order. So if we want some folders, say, to always appear at the top of the list, even if they're not alphabetic, we've added a sort order column here so we can customize the order reports and folders display to a user within Exago. And then we've got a couple other columns for additional properties here, like Henry name. But I'm going to leave those for now, just for the sake of simplicity. So these are our two tables. And what we're going to see as we go into the code is that these tables are going to be joined when we need to retrieve the list of reports for a user or save an individual report. Great. So that's a quick view of our database. And I just want to pause there to see if there are any questions. Okay, a couple of questions came in, which are great. I mentioned an enhancement for 2018.2, our version coming out at the end of this summer. But the example I'm looking at today, and of course you folks can use as well, is certainly available for 2017.3, our latest version, as well as it's actually a feature that's been established and available since 2011. So this is a long established feature, and you can use these examples today. There are a few enhancements coming later this year, and I'll talk to what those are towards the end of the presentation. That was a great question. Thanks for asking. Okay, great. So we've got our database table here. Now it's time to look at the code. So in our folder management, we've, say, inserted our database SQL. We're ready to look at the actual code. So we can open up this project. And of course, I've already got it open here. In looking on the right, this project has a couple of things. So we're primarily going to focus on this class, foldermanagement.cs. But before we do that, we're going to look at our references and make sure that we have our Web Reports API DLL here. And in fact, I'm going to delete it and re-add it from my Exago installation just to make sure it's on the right version. So here, I'm going to pull it from the path that I've installed Exago in to make sure that the versions line up so that there's not going to be any conflicts there. Okay, so with that reference updated, we're going to look at this particular class that we've called folder management. And it starts out with a couple of things here. primarily a database and a connection string. This is how we're going to connect to the database. And we'll talk about where these values are stored a little later on as we configure Exago. Then it has two helper methods right at the beginning. For now, I'm going to skip over these, but we're going to come back to them in just a little bit. And then we're going to start by looking at actually the most critical method within this folder management, which is called get report list. For some of the older versions of folder management, you might see this called get report list XML. Either are fine. And this method as an input takes a session info object. So for folks who have been on our labs for action events and server events, you'll be familiar with this session info object. But essentially, this object contains all the information from the configuration of Exago and includes the changes that have been made via the API. So this object has information exactly as to who the user is and any other permissions that the host application has stored for this particular session. This will be really useful as we go to retrieve a list of reports for the particular user. So as you might expect from this code, we're going to start out by building a SQL statement in order to retrieve the list of reports from the database. And this query is actually a little bit large. It's a little complex, but essentially what it's going to do is it's going to go to the database and it's going to get some information from the report table, particularly, the name, the ID, the lead, whether or not a report is a folder or a report, what folder each report and subfolder reside in, what type of report there are, all the things we sort of looked at in those two tables. It's going to select all that information, but it's actually going to select that information from a join between the report table and the report access table. And one of the parts it's going to do as it does this, it's going to apply what we're calling a permission clause. And that permission clause is going to check that the party based for published reports, reports per class, per company, and per user are all only the reports that the active user should see. So based on each user's ID, what company they're from, what class. In this case, we're using class to think of as role, but you could think of this as working group, or really any grouping of user that makes sense within your application. And of course, any reports that are available to everyone. And what it's going to do is it's going to always apply this permissioning. And it's going to then from here, so build this long SQL statement. And this, it chooses the order everything's going to come out. And then it's going to add some permission parameters. And these parameters are going to match up to the SQL we just looked at here with this filter clause. And importantly here, the parameters are going to retrieve values, SQL parameters, I should say, are going to retrieve values from that session info object. So they're going to use that session info object to identify who the user is, what class, company, and specific user ID they might have, and apply that to our SQL to make sure a user is only seeing the specific individual reports and folders that they should have access to. Then, of course, we're going to execute the SQL. So this is the most important call to the database. This is what's going to populate the list of folders and reports that a user has access to. Then we're going to get this back from this database. If it's empty, that means maybe the user doesn't have access to anything. We're simply going to return a very short string of XML that just says, hey, there's nothing to see here. But most likely, it's not going to be empty. It's not going to have 0 rows. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the data set and we're going to use this recursive helper method we skipped over just a moment ago. And we're going to turn it from a data set from our database into a list of what we call entity objects. So diving in here, I did say we were going to go a little deep in the code. This is going to be a recursive method here, and it's going to loop through the rows from our data set, and it's going to build what we call entities. And now an entity is just an object representation of a report and a folder. And that entity is going to have some critical properties here. So I'm just going to dive into the definition there. Each report and folder has an ID. Obviously, it has a name, a Boolean indicating if it's a report or a folder that we call a leaf flag. It's going to have this permission flag called a read-only flag, and that's going to indicate if it should be locked or not. And it's going to have a string called a UDF. We're using the word UDF to mean user-defined field, but really think of this as this is going to be a JSON string that stores a number of properties. In fact, we call these UDF properties. And these properties are going to have allow you to store any extra permissions you want. So maybe you want to make it so that users can't duplicate a report, or users can't rename a report. You can add additional properties here inside these UDF properties and inside this UDF string, which is going to be a JSON string. And then for each entity, you can store those here and we'll pass them to Exago. Okay, so we're building out a list of entities. And as I mentioned, this is a recursive method. I won't go into the weeds of it, but essentially it builds out the list of entities, but it's a list, and each entity itself has a list of all the subfolders and reports that reside inside of it. Okay, so within our getReport method, we've queried our database. We've looked to see if it's empty, and if so, we just return a very simple string to tell Exago, hey, this user doesn't have anything. And then we've taken our database results, and we've used this recursive method to build a list of objects we call entities that are all the folders and reports within them that the user has. And critically, each entity has this UDF field that we're going to store information in, custom information like custom permissions, or even in our case, we're storing the ID of the report and folder in there as well. So with that list of entities, we can then use the other helper method we skipped over earlier to build an XML document. And we're going to pass this list of entities into our method called writeXML. So I'm just going to jump to the definition. This is one of the two methods we jumped over to begin with. And what this does is it loops through our list of entities, and it builds each entity into an XML node. And for all the children, that is to say subfolders and reports within the top level entities, it does the same thing again. So again, simple recursive method here, but it just takes our list of entities and turns it into an XML structure. And then that XML structure is returned to Exago as a string for consumption. So this method is probably our most complex method. It has sort of our most complex SQL, and then it does two sort of recursive loops here. But essentially, it's taking from our database what reports and folders the user has, building it into an XML string, and then returning it to Exago. So I want to pause there, as this is our sort of most complex method. Does anyone have any questions so far? Great. So for the sake of time, I'm going to keep going here. And I'm probably going to go through the other methods a little bit faster, more just highlighting what they do. So the getReport list method tells Exago, here's the list of reports and folders a user can have access to from our system. The getReport method is if a user selects a specific report and says, hey, I want to edit this report, or I want to run this report, the getReport method is then called by Exago for the actual definition of that report. So again, it's always going to have this session info object. We're going to pass the report name and the UDF that JSON string we mentioned previously. So here, our method, our example method, is going to check if the UDF string here is null or empty. Ideally, it's not, because we've stored some custom content in there. We've stored the IDs in here. So if it's not empty, we can simply use it to grab the data that we need from it, the custom fields and IDs. If it is, we have a helper method that will take the name, split the name up, so the name being all the folders and up until the report name. We'll split that name up and actually build that same UDF string. But importantly, once we have the UDF string, we can use it to get the ID of the report or folder in question, really the report in this case. And we can do a simple select statement. So we can just say, hey, give me the content from our reports table where the report ID is the ID passed inside that UDF string. Similarly, we have a save report method. Again, it's going to have the session info object, so we know who the user is. We know the name of the report, and we have the XML content for the report. Now, again, what we're going to do is first we're going to build that UDF properties. So we're going to say, hey, does this report exist? And we're going to check based on the name. If we get back a UDF string from our database, then the report already exists, and we're simply going to call this method save existing report. If that report doesn't exist, if that UDF doesn't exist, this is a new report, and we're going to call a method called save new report. Now these two methods, I won't go into detail again because they're sort of helper methods, but essentially they're just going to insert new rows into our database to save a report or update the existing row to update the report with a new definition of that report. And you can see that here, right? We're inserting the report for new reports, and we're updating an existing report. We're doing an update method in our database. Of course, we can also rename reports. So simply here, we have a method if a user renames a report. And again, that will be an update call to our database. And of course, we have a couple of helper methods in case a user is updating just the name of the report or a folder as well. A user might delete a report, and in which case we can check that is deleted column we mentioned before, and we can update it so that it changes the flag here to is deleted. And that gives us our soft deletes we mentioned adding the capabilities for. And that's really it for report methods. A user can get a report, save a report, rename a report, and delete a report. Now we're going to have a similar set of methods here for folders. So as this is going to be a little repetitive, I'm not going to go through all the methods, but similarly, a user can add a folder, they can rename a folder, and they can move a folder. And then we're going to have, and of course, they can delete a folder, sorry. And then we're going to have a list of methods for templates. This is going to be very similar to our report list. So we have a get template list, just like we have a get report list. And just like that, we're going to similarly select a list of all the templates from our database and based on which user can access them. And then, of course, a user can get a specific template's bit content. They can save a new template if they have permissions to do so. And then we have themes. Now, themes are going to be things like chart themes, map themes, express view themes. And again, we have a get theme list method that gets the list of all the available themes. And you'll notice this is by type. So we're going to get just the chart themes, just the crosstab themes, just the map themes, and that get theme list is going to call our database and get the list of available themes. And similarly, we're going to be able to check, does the theme exist? Can I have the content of a theme? And can I save a theme if a user adds a new theme? So those are our methods within our folder management code. gone through them briefly, of course, but I wanted to keep this webinar, pretty short and tangible here. So before we move away from the code, I just want to check, are there any other questions? Okay, great. So that's a brief look at our code sample. Of course, you can customize and tailor this to match your environment as well. You might ask, hey, I saw some other classes and CS files in that project. What else can this code sample do? So one of the things this code sample does is it has a server event to handle getting and setting user preferences. And we actually covered these server events in great detail in a previous webinar, which of course you can see in our support site. We have the recording of that webinar. So I'm not going to cover these methods here, but the code is there in that sample if you want it. And then we also have an action event. And this action event allows us to use folder management to change the drop-down a user sees as they click on a report. For the sake of time, I'm also not going to cover that in today's webinar, but if you're interested, this may be a great webinar topic for the future, so it's something we'll probably cover not too long from now. Today's primary focus here is on this folder management class. All right, so that's the code. I did mention we have to configure Exago, and what we'll see here is configuring Exago is pretty easy. The first thing we're going to do is change the report path. So in the admin console in Exago, we're just going to go to the general settings, the main settings, and under the report path, we're going to add, instead of specifying a file location to say, hey, save the reports in this place on our server, we're going to specify a DLL, an assembly. So here we're just specifying a path to our assembly and the specific class that we just reviewed to showcase all of our methods. So this lets Exago know, hey, instead of saving to the file system, use this assembly and call this specific class with the methods you know to call that are all listed, of course, in our documentation. The other thing our assembly method relied upon was parameters from the session info object. So of course, we're going to build parameters into Exago. The parameters in the admin console are listed here, and we can add them. And the important part here is we're setting these parameters values dynamically as Exago launches from our API from the host application. We've covered the API launch in previous webinars as well and shown how to set these parameter values. All right, the last step to configuring Exago is within the Exago installation, there's a web.config and appsettings.config file, and we have to pass a couple of values. We have to save a couple of values in these files. The steps to doing that are actually detailed in the README here, so you can see exactly what we need to add here. And these are essentially values that are going to be retrieved by our folder management code to know what the database table names are, how to connect to the database, things like that. So these are detailed in the README. I won't spend too much time on them today. So that's a recap of how to set up this code sample, how to utilize folder management today. I want to pause and see if there are any questions on folder management and its current implementation, why you might use it, how to use it, etc. Oh, great. A great question just came in. So one thing I want to mention is we're working in a .NET assembly with our code sample today. Folder management also does have a SOAP-based version. So if you're not programming in a .NET language, you can use that as well. Though, to be honest, I think most of our clients use the .NET version here because particularly we have this sample that you can take and utilize out of the box here. Okay, great. So with that, I did mention at the beginning that there are going to be some changes in our 18.2 version. So I just want to highlight some of the things as I'm really excited about them. I think they're great features that are coming. So first of all, we're going to have an out-of-the-box option. So while folder management is an extensibility feature today, we're going to have Exago configured so that instead of using the file system, we'll have a built-in option to use folder management. It'll use a file-based database called SQLite, and it's something you can just enable, and it'll work out of the box. The other thing I should mention there is that if you don't want to use the SQLite database, you'll be able to just point to a database. You won't have to implement folder management or some custom code. You can just say, hey, use the folder management system as you already have it, but go to this database instead, and you'll be able to let that run there. So that's less code you have to maintain if you like our default implementation, if you don't want to make any changes to it. Instead of using report names and those UDF strings like we saw in the code today, it'll have GUID-based IDs by default, so all the reports will have those IDs. Of course, we'll still maintain support, so if you want to use custom folder management as you are today, where you want to change how some of those methods behave and carry over some of your customizations, we'll have that. But instead of having to utilize those UDF strings to store the IDs as we did in the code we looked at today, those will be part of the signature, so it'll be easier, there'll be a simpler code there. We'll still support legacy folder management, so if you're using a folder management today and you don't want to make any changes, you'll still be able to do so, but it will just be a little less efficient than the enhancement here. So you can think of this as enhancement as performance improvement as well. Though to do so, you'll have to just adjust your folder management code. The code we looked at today will require very little adjustment, and we'll put out an updated version for folks who still want to customize folder management, but it'll use those IDs, and we'll likely have a webinar showing what that migration looks like as well. It'll be pretty well contained there. The last neat part, once we've got the system that natively switches over IDs, you'll be able to support localization of report and folder names. So if you want to have one folder, but for different users, you want it to have a different name, you'll be able to do that, which I think is a kind of neat thing because we have such great built-in multi-language capabilities that we've mentioned before. Okay, great set of questions came in. So the first question to come in was the pros and cons of storing on a database versus server. So the pros of using a database, of course, is the ease of use of backing them up. Database can, of course, be scaled a little bit differently. But I think the biggest pro here is that you can use folder management with a database to have fine-grained control over report access, and it's just baked in. You don't have to worry about it as you build your roles through the API, and you can do more fine-grained control by groups and things as well. So it simplifies your API code, I think, is the biggest advantage there. The transition to a database, a great question came in on how much effort it is to transition to using folder management in a database. And that really depends on where you are in your implementation of Exago. Of course, if you're just getting started, then there's very little effort because you're just getting started. You don't have any reports and folders. Moving report definitions over can be very easy. You can script it, or you can use our upload-download feature built into the Exago UI if you don't have that many reports. So those are all factors in your transition, but I would say it's a pretty easy transition in general. And the other question is there any difference noticeable in response time? There shouldn't be. Certainly these methods should all be very performant. We've fine-tuned our write XML and those recursive methods to be as quick as possible. And a database, unless you've got zillions of reports, should be very performant and responsive there. So there shouldn't be any noticeable response time difference. And in fact, with our 18.2 enhancements, we'll see improved performance. And a great question came in, which is when is the 18.2 release? So our 18.1 release is coming in the middle of May on the 15th there. And our 18.2 is slated for the end of the summer, so I would say mid to late August. Great question. Said, we had a lot of reports in production. Will migration be easier from 18.2 versus 17.3? I honestly think if you moved it folder management on 17.3 today, it'll make migration easier for 18.2, but we'll have a script to help folks migrating in 18.2 as well. So I think migration for that version will be, very manageable and should be pretty painless. One thing I did have a request from a attendee here to show was how do you put themes in folder management? I did mention this previously, so what I want to do is show in our reports table, there are certain themes. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to sort by that type column so we can see all the themes. And built into Exago, of course, within our installation. So here I'm in my, my 17.3 installation of Exago. We have a themes folder. And in here, we have all these WRT something files, WRT H for chart, M for map, things like that. And different types of files will have different content. For example, a chart theme is going to simply be a list of colors for the particular chart. So based on what theme there is, those are going to be here. If you switch over to using folder management, you'll want to port these themes, or the ones you like. You can pick and choose or build your own themes. We've actually talked about themes in a previous webinar. You'll want to bring your themes into your folder management system. So following our example, what that'll look like is you'll add a row here. You'll give the theme a name, and then you'll add the content. You could do this using an insert statement or manually here. So, more likely you'll use an insert statement. Should be pretty easy for any DBA here. You don't have to worry about the leaf flag or bit content because themes don't have folders, and they're not byte content based things. We'll say the type is 2. This will tell Exago, hey, this is a theme. We'll of course say that the theme is not deleted because we want it to appear. And then we'll say what type of theme it is. So you'll see these values here, this is a chart theme, this is a map theme, this is a crosstab, etc. If you want to keep track of who created themes, of course you can. And then the theme will have its own unique ID. And in our case, we just gave it an owner to know, who built the theme. And then in the report access table, we'll add a corresponding row for the particular theme's ID. And in our case, we made all our themes available to all of our users. So we just made an access row that says, hey, this is for everyone. So party type is 0, party ID is the word everyone. And of course, this theme is active. So if you want to, though, you could have different themes. So maybe a particular company of one of your clients or a particular group of users has a theme. You can make themes, a customized list per user as well. So that's how you would bring over a theme from our folder system here to folder management. And of course, you don't have to we have a lot of themes that we come with out of the box. You can pick and choose your favorites. And of course, you can build your own as well. So I did want to mention that. I know there was a request. So I want to take one more pause just to see. Okay, 2 other good questions came in. In here, of course, we said that there's a soft delete. And the question is, how does one undo a soft delete? So let's say this report, this dashboard was deleted at some point. A user might call you up and say, hey, this report got deleted. You can, within Exago's UI, we don't have a way to undo this soft delete, but a DBA could come in here, a developer could come in here, and all they would have to do is change this back to false. So they could do that with an update statement, or in a program like DB Visualizer, you can simply change this value back and then just hit save. That will undelete the particular field, particular report or folder. Okay, great. So there are a few more questions, but before we dive into those, I just want to say, first of all, thank you everyone for attending. I know this was one of our longer webinars. And this support lab went a little deeper in code than most of them do, but I hope you guys got a lot out of it. Like I said, this really is one of my favorite features in Exago. And personally, I'm very excited for the enhancements to it, but I think it's a really useful feature today as well. With that, after the webinar, when you leave the webinar, you'll be prompted to fill out a survey. We always appreciate that. And on that survey, you can actually vote for next month's tech topic. So we have 2 topics at hand. On the 9th of May, our end user lab is going to be on interactivity on output. So we're going to look at interactive filters, prompting things, parameters, all different types of interactive capabilities. And then on the 23rd, up to the folks on this webinar, we always go by the vote here. We're either going to do a deep dive on parameters, what they are, how to use them, different ways to use them, where they can be used, etc. Or a customization feature we call the schedule of recipients window, which I think is kind of a neat custom dialogue that folks can use if you're using the scheduler and you want to make it a little bit more user-friendly and integrate a little bit more tightly with your application. So these are 2 very cool topics. So please, after the webinar, make sure to vote. And of course, if either topic interests you, sign up to attend next month's webinar as well. Great. With that, I again want to say thank you. Thank you for attending. Of course, all of our webinars are recorded, so you'll be able to see this on our support site likely tomorrow when the videos finalized. But in the meantime, I just want to say again, on behalf of our team, thanks and happy reporting. Take care.